The K-9 crashed a senator's speech. What he dragged in left the crowd in absolute horror. Senator Richard Holloway stood before the roaring crowd, his practiced smile convincing them that he was their champion, their beacon of hope in a troubled city. His words, carefully crafted by a team of speechwriters, painted a picture of progress, of a future where the streets were safe and prosperity was within reach for all. But as he spoke, his mind drifted to the secrets that lurked beneath the polished veneer. The backroom deals, the bribes, the threats, all necessary steps on his climb to power. And now, with the disappearance of that meddlesome journalist, his position was more secure than ever. No one would dare challenge him now, or so he thought. As Holloway paused for dramatic effect, a commotion erupted at the edge of the stage. The crowd gasped and murmured as a large German shepherd burst through the security line, dragging something dark and tattered in its jaws. Holloway froze, his carefully rehearsed words dying on his lips as the dog bounded up to him and dropped the object at his feet. It was a jacket, torn and stained with what could only be blood. The same jacket that had been worn by the missing journalist just days before. Miles away, in a cluttered precinct office, Detective James Carter slammed down the phone in frustration. Another dead end, another witness too afraid to talk. This case would be the death of him. He turned to the only source of comfort in the room, the framed photo of himself with Titan, his former K-9 partner. Carter had spent years on the force with Titan by his side, tackling everything from drug busts to kidnappings. There was no one he trusted more. But Titan was retired now, living out his golden years with Carter's sister in the suburbs. And Carter was left alone to face the corruption that had taken hold of his city. He glanced at the case files sprawled across his desk, his eyes landing on the smiling face of Senator Holloway. The man was as slippery as they come, always one step ahead of the law. But this time, Carter was determined to bring him down. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. "It's on every channel," his captain said grimly. "You need to see this." Carter followed him to the break room, where a dozen officers were huddled around the small TV. And there on the screen was Titan, standing triumphantly on stage next to a very pale Senator Holloway. The city was in an uproar. Overnight, Senator Holloway had gone from beloved leader to public enemy number one. The footage of Titan and the bloody jacket had gone viral, sparking protests and calls for Holloway's immediate resignation. But Holloway wasn't going down without a fight. In a tense press conference, he denounced the slanderous accusations and vowed to uncover the conspiracy behind the supposed evidence. His loyal supporters rallied around him, dismissing the journalist's disappearance as fake news. Carter watched the chaos unfold with a mix of satisfaction and dread. Titan's discovery had blown the case wide open, but it had also put a target on the dog's back. If Holloway was willing to make a respected journalist vanish, what would he do to a retired police dog? Carter's first priority was to get Titan somewhere safe. But as he drove out to his sister's place, his mind raced with the possibilities. The jacket was a major break, but it was far from a smoking gun. To take Holloway down, they'd need hard evidence and lots of it. But where to start? Holloway's web of corruption ran deep, and Carter knew he couldn't trust anyone in the department. He'd have to assemble his own team and work outside the system. It was a daunting prospect, but with Titan by his side once again, Carter felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would see justice served, no matter the cost. Titan greeted Carter with his trademark enthusiasm, his tail wagging furiously as he bounded across the yard. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted from Carter's shoulders. Here was someone he could always count on, a true friend through thick and thin. But there was no time to waste on sentiment. After a hurried explanation to his bewildered sister, Carter loaded Titan into the car and set off, his mind already racing with plans. Their first stop was the offices of the city's last remaining independent newspaper. The journalist who had vanished had been one of their top investigative reporters, and Carter hoped her colleagues might have some insight into what she'd been working on. The editor-in-chief, a sharp-eyed woman named Julia Reyes, greeted them warily. She'd been fielding calls all day from reporters clamoring for a scoop, and the sight of a police badge put her on edge. But when Carter explained the situation and showed her the photos of the bloody jacket, her demeanor changed. Maria was onto something big, she said, her voice tight with emotion, something that scared her. She said she'd uncovered proof of Holloway's dirty dealings, but she wanted to verify it before publishing. Carter leaned forward, his heart pounding. What kind of proof? Julia hesitated, glancing around the newsroom. I don't know all the details, but she mentioned offshore bank accounts, shell companies, mysterious payoffs. She said it went all the way to the top. Carter's mind raced. If Maria had found a money trail, it could be the key to unraveling Holloway's empire. But if Holloway had gotten to her first, that evidence might be lost forever. He thanked Julia for her help and promised to keep her updated. As they left the building, Titan whined softly, sensing the tension in the air. Carter scratched him behind the ears, trying to project calm he didn't feel. They were on the right track, but the road ahead would be long and dangerous. And with Holloway growing more desperate by the hour, every moment counted. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and dead-end leads. Carter called in every favor he'd earned over his years on the force, but Holloway's influence ran deep. Doors slammed shut, witnesses clammed up, and evidence disappeared. Even Titan seemed to be losing hope, his usual boundless energy replaced by a subdued watchfulness. Carter couldn't blame him. They were up against a formidable enemy, one with the power to make people disappear without a trace. But just as despair began to set in, a glimmer of hope arrived in the form of an unlikely ally. Liam Novak was a young hacker who had once been arrested by Carter for cybercrimes. But prison had changed him, and now he was determined to use his skills for good. I heard about what you're doing, he said, his eyes alight with excitement as he shook Carter's hand. And I want to help. Holloway's not the only one who can play dirty. With Liam's help, they began to piece together the puzzle of Holloway's empire. They traced shell companies to offshore havens, unraveled complex webs of ownership, and followed the money to its shadowy sources. Slowly but surely, a picture emerged of a vast criminal enterprise, one that had its tentacles in every corner of the city. Bribery, extortion, money laundering. Holloway had a hand in it all, and he'd been using his position as senator to cover his tracks. It was a daunting realization, but it also gave them a sense of purpose. They were no longer just a handful of individuals tilting at windmills. They were part of something bigger, a movement to take back their city from the grip of corruption. As they worked, the bonds between them grew stronger. Liam and Carter found common ground in their shared desire for justice, while Titan provided a steady presence of loyalty and courage. Together, they formed a team that Holloway would learn to fear. Senator Holloway paced his office, his fists clenched in barely contained rage. Everything was falling apart. That damn dog had ruined everything. He had underestimated Carter, dismissing him as just another burnt-out cop. But now the detective was proving to be a formidable adversary, chipping away at the foundations of Holloway's carefully constructed empire. Everywhere he turned, Holloway saw signs of dissent. His once loyal allies were starting to distance themselves, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Even his own staff seemed to be wavering, their eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting the FBI to burst in at any moment. He needed to regain control and fast. But how? His usual tactics of bribery and intimidation had failed. Carter and his team were incorruptible, driven by a righteous zeal that Holloway found both puzzling and infuriating. As he stared out the window at the city he had once thought he owned, an idea began to take shape. If he couldn't beat them at their own game, perhaps it was time to change the rules. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had hoped never to use. "It's me," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I have a job for you, a big one." As he outlined his plan, a slow smile spread across his face. Carter and his little band of do-gooders thought they had him cornered, but they had no idea what they were up against. Richard Holloway always had an ace up his sleeve. Detective Carter stood in front of the makeshift evidence board in Liam's cramped apartment, his eyes scanning the web of connections they had uncovered. It was a tangled mess of lines and arrows, but patterns were starting to emerge. At the center of it all was Holloway, the spider at the heart of the web. But he wasn't acting alone. They had identified a network of associates, each with their own role to play in the senator's criminal empire. There was the shady businessman who laundered Holloway's dirty money through a chain of nightclubs and restaurants. The corrupt judge who made sure Holloway's allies always got a slap on the wrist in court. The ruthless enforcer who kept the senator's enemies in line through violence and intimidation. It was a formidable array of adversaries, but Carter refused to be daunted. He had faced worse odds before and come out on top. And this time he wasn't alone. Liam had proven to be an invaluable ally, his hacking skills opening doors that would have otherwise remained locked. And Titan, of course, was always by his side, a silent but steadfast presence. Together, they had made progress that Carter once would have thought impossible. But they still lacked the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that would tie it all together and bring Holloway down for good. As if sensing his thoughts, Titan let out a soft whine and nuzzled Carter's hand. The detective smiled and scratched the dog behind the ears. "We'll get him, boy," he murmured. "We'll get him." Just then, the intercom buzzed, jolting them both to attention. Carter frowned and glanced at Liam, who shrugged in confusion. No one knew they were here, or so they thought. Cautiously, Carter approached the intercom and pressed the button. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. There was a crackle of static, then a voice that sent a chill down his spine. "Detective Carter. We need to talk." Carter stared at the man seated across from him, trying to reconcile the nervous figure before him with the ruthless enforcer he knew him to be. Diego Mendez had been Holloway's right-hand man for years, a shadowy presence who struck fear into the hearts of the senator's enemies. But now he looked haggard and hunted, his eyes darting around the dingy diner as if expecting an attack at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and strained. "I want out," he said, his hands trembling as he clutched his coffee mug. "I can't do this anymore. The things I've seen, the things I've done. It's eating me up inside." Carter leaned forward, his heart racing. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Help us take Holloway down, and I promise you, we'll protect you." Mendez hesitated, his eyes haunted. "You don't know what he's capable of," he whispered. "The man's a monster. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." But as Carter listened, a picture began to emerge of a man who had once been a loyal soldier, but had grown disillusioned with the cause he served. Mendez spoke of Holloway's cruelty, of the senator's casual disregard for human life. He told of bribes and blackmail, of powerful people bought and sold like cattle. And then he dropped the bombshell. "He's planning something big," Mendez said, his voice trembling. "Something that will make everything else look like child's play. And if he succeeds, God help us all." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever Holloway was planning, they had to stop him, and fast. But as he pressed Mendez for details, the man suddenly went pale and clutched at his chest. "No," he gasped, his eyes widening in horror. He knows I'm here." Before Carter could react, Mendez pitched forward, his body convulsing. The detective lunged to catch him, but it was too late. Diego Mendez was dead before he hit the ground, a look of terror frozen on his face. The city was in chaos. Riots had broken out in the streets, fueled by rumors of Holloway's impending downfall. The senator had gone to ground, barricaded in his fortress-like mansion with a phalanx of heavily armed guards. But Detective Carter knew they couldn't wait any longer. Mendez's death had been a warning shot, a sign that Holloway was growing desperate. Whatever the senator was planning, they had to stop him before it was too late. Liam had managed to dig up blueprints of Holloway's estate, revealing a labyrinth of underground tunnels and secret rooms. It was a daunting prospect, but Carter knew they had no choice. They had to go in, and fast. Assembling a small team of trusted allies, Carter set out under cover of darkness. Titan led the way, his keen nose picking up scents that human senses could never detect. They moved silently through the shadows, avoiding the patrols of guards that roamed the grounds. As they approached the mansion, Carter felt a sense of unease wash over him. Something wasn't right. The guards were too few, too relaxed. It was as if they were waiting for something. And then, with a sickening lurch, he realized the truth. They had been betrayed. Someone had tipped Holloway off, and now they were walking into a trap. But it was too late to turn back. As they burst through the door, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction, and Carter found himself diving for cover behind a marble pillar. Beside him, Titan let out a yelp of pain as a bullet grazed his flank. Carter gritted his teeth and returned fire, his heart pounding in his chest. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had no choice. They had to push forward and had to find Holloway before it was too late. And then, through the smoke and chaos, he saw him. Senator Richard Holloway, standing at the top of a grand staircase, a triumphant sneer on his face. In his hand, he held a detonator, and Carter knew with sickening certainty what it was for. The city's water supply. Holloway was going to poison it, to hold the entire population hostage in a twisted bid for power. And only Carter and his ragtag band stood in his way. Time seemed to slow down as Detective Carter stared up at the figure of Senator Holloway, his finger poised over the detonator button. Around them, the gunfire continued to rage, but all Carter could focus on was the madness in Holloway's eyes. "Don't do this," he shouted, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "Think about what you're doing. You'll be killing innocent people." But Holloway only laughed, a cold, merciless sound that sent shivers down Carter's spine. "Innocent," he sneered. "There are no innocents in this city. Only those who are too weak to seize power for themselves." He raised the detonator higher, his thumb tensing on the button. Carter knew he had only seconds to act. He glanced around wildly, searching for something, anything that could stop Holloway. And then he saw it. A glint of metal, half hidden behind a fallen guard. A sniper rifle loaded and ready. Carter didn't hesitate. He dove for the rifle, snatching it up and rolling into a crouch. Beside him, Titan let out a low growl, his hackles raised as he sensed the danger. "Last chance, Holloway," Carter yelled, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. "Drop the detonator and come quietly." But Holloway only smiled, a grotesque parody of the charming grin he had once flashed for the cameras. "You won't shoot me," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're too much of..." The sniper rifle kicked against Carter's shoulder as he pulled the trigger, the sound of the shot echoing through the cavernous hall. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and then Holloway staggered backward, a look of shock and disbelief on his face. The detonator fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and skidding away. Carter held his breath, waiting for the explosion that would signal the end of everything he had fought for. But it never came. The device lay inert on the polished marble, a useless hunk of metal and wires. Holloway had been bluffing, trying to buy himself time to escape. A ragged cheer went up from Carter's team as they surged forward, securing the fallen senator and rounding up the last of his guards. It was over. They had won. But even as the adrenaline began to fade, Carter knew that their work was far from finished. Holloway's network of corruption ran deep, and rooting out all of his accomplices would take time and patience. Still, as he looked around at the faces of his team, bruised and bloodied but triumphant, he felt a swell of pride. They had done the impossible, had taken on a man who thought himself untouchable and brought him to his knees. And at the center of it all was Titan, his loyal partner through thick and thin. The dog had been a constant presence by his side, a reminder of the good that still existed in the world. As the authorities arrived to take Holloway away, Carter knelt down and wrapped his arms around Titan's neck, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it. We really did it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. As the city struggled to come to terms with the shocking revelations about their once-beloved senator, the media descended like vultures, picking over every detail of Holloway's sordid history. But amidst the chaos, there were also moments of quiet reflection, as the people began to ask themselves how they had allowed such corruption to take root in the first place. Carter and his team became unlikely heroes, symbols of the courage and integrity that had been lacking for so long. Julia Reyes, the intrepid editor who had helped them uncover the truth, found herself at the center of a media storm. But she handled the attention with grace, using her newfound platform to call for greater transparency and accountability in government. Liam, the young hacker who had risked everything to help bring Holloway down, found himself flooded with job offers from tech companies eager to harness his skills for good. But he turned them all down, choosing instead to use his talents to help other whistleblowers and activists fighting for justice. And Detective Carter, the man who had started it all, found himself grappling with a new sense of purpose. He had always been a good cop, but now he realized that his true calling was to be a voice for the voiceless, a champion for those who had been forgotten and marginalized. Together, they formed a new kind of team, one dedicated to rooting out corruption wherever it hid. They knew that the fight would never truly be over, that there would always be those who sought to abuse their power for personal gain. But they also knew that they were not alone. Across the city, ordinary people were standing up and demanding change, refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. It was a movement that had been brewing for years, and now, thanks to their efforts, it had finally found its moment. As Carter stood before a cheering crowd, Titan by his side, he felt a sense of hope that he had never known before. They had won a great victory, but it was only the beginning. Together, they would build a better world, one where the truth could never be buried and justice would always prevail. Months passed, and the city began to heal. The scars left by Holloway's reign of corruption would not fade easily, but slowly, steadily, a new sense of purpose began to take hold. Julia's newspaper, once on the brink of collapse, found itself at the forefront of a new era of investigative journalism. With the public hungering for the truth like never before, she and her team worked tirelessly to expose wrongdoing wherever they found it. Liam's skills were in high demand, but he chose to focus his efforts on building a network of hacktivists dedicated to protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful to account. His work brought him into contact with whistleblowers and activists from around the world, each fighting their own battles against corruption and injustice. And Carter, the man who had once been a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, found himself at the center of a growing movement for change. He spoke at rallies and conferences, sharing his story and calling on others to join the fight. But even as they celebrated their victories, they knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Holloway's trial was a media circus, with the former senator using every trick in the book to try to avoid responsibility for his crimes. In the end, however, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The testimony of Carter and his team, along with the mountains of documents and data they had uncovered, painted a damning picture of a man who had betrayed the public trust in the most egregious way possible. As the verdict was read out, a hush fell over the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, when it came, was a staggering 25 years in federal prison. For Holloway, it was the ultimate humiliation, a fall from grace so complete that it left him shattered and broken. But for Carter and his team, it was a moment of vindication, a testament to the power of truth and the courage of those who refused to be silenced. As they walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight, Titan let out a joyous bark and bounded ahead, his tail wagging furiously. For the first time in months, Carter felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought a monster to justice and given hope to a city that had lost its way. 1 year later, Carter stood before a sea of faces, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. It was the anniversary of Holloway's conviction, and the city had come together to celebrate how far they had come. Gone were the days of fear and despair, when the streets had echoed with the sound of gunfire and the air had been thick with the stench of corruption. In their place was a new sense of unity and purpose, a determination to build a better future for all. Julia's newspaper had become a beacon of truth, shining a light into the darkest corners of the city and giving voice to those who had been silenced for too long. Liam's network of hacktivists had grown into a global movement, working tirelessly to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful to account. And Carter himself had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that one person, armed with nothing more than courage and conviction, could make a difference in the world. As he looked out over the crowd, his eyes fell on a familiar figure standing at the back. It was Titan, his fur now flecked with gray but his spirit as strong as ever. The dog had been his constant companion through all the trials and tribulations of the past year, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between human and animal. Carter felt a lump form in his throat as he began to speak, his voice cracking with emotion. 1 year ago, he said, we stood together in the face of a great darkness. We stood together, and we said, no more. No more corruption. No more injustice. No more silence in the face of evil. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising into the clear blue sky. And as Carter looked around at the faces of those who had fought alongside him, he knew that they had achieved something truly remarkable. They had not just brought down a corrupt politician or exposed a web of lies. They had sparked a movement, a great awakening that would continue to ripple outwards, touching lives and changing hearts in ways they could never have imagined. And at the center of it all was a simple truth, one that Carter had carried with him through all the long years of struggle and sacrifice, that the power to change the world lies not in the hands of the mighty or the wealthy, but in the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. As the crowd began to disperse, Carter felt a soft nudge at his hand. He looked down to see Titan gazing up at him, his eyes shining with love and loyalty. And in that moment, he knew that he had found his true calling, his reason for being. Together, they would continue to fight the good fight, to be a voice for the voiceless and a light in the darkness. And though the road ahead would be long and hard, they would face it with courage and hope, secure in the knowledge that they were not alone. For in the end, it was the spirit of unity and compassion that would carry them through, the unbreakable bonds of love and friendship that would light the way to a brighter tomorrow. And as long as they had each other, Carter knew there was nothing they could not achieve.